Hello, this is the first of two videos that's going to be covering paper two for Film Studies A level. Now, obviously, we just had the recent first paper, which was quite a good paper from my perspective. I thought it was a nice one. There were some questions that sort of threw people a little bit, but on the whole, I think it was quite a nice paper. In terms of paper two, obviously, that's your foreign language films and then the 320 markers. This video is focused on the 20 markers. Whereas the other video that I'm going to be doing is the foreign language film. And my foreign language films are Pan's Labyrinth and Parasite. But in paper two, these ones, I'm going to be covering Amy, the Buster Keaton Shorts collection, and Mulholland Drive. Now, the way I've split this up is I'm going to go through briefly the kind of the specialist areas that you need to keep in focus. So for each of the 20 marks, the specialist focus area that you needed to have. And then I'm going to go into each micro element, such as cinematography, mise-en-scène, and so on, and discuss those with heavy reliance on that specialist area, okay? So I will not be able to cover absolutely everything. This is not a comprehensive list of everything that could be asked, but it's a good general overview for your last-minute revision, okay? So just some quick wins for each of these areas. First of all, I'm going to be covering Amy. Now, in Amy, the core areas to study are digital debates and documentary filmmaking, and sort of the comparison between the two. Okay. Now, digital debates, the way that I've gone about this is asking questions surrounding the idea of digital debates and sort of attempting to answer those questions as I go through. Now, remember, when I go through each individual micro elements, I'll be making reference back to this. So don't think this is the only time I'll be mentioning digital debates, but I just thought I'd go through some of these questions. So first of all, digital footage versus just traditional film footage. Obviously, digital footage is a unique one because it's easily manipulated, but it also tends to be quite intimate because digital footage tends to be shot on personal devices and so on. Okay, so the first thing I've got here, is it right to be using intimate found footage to produce documentaries? Was this level of intimacy possible before the digital age? Yes and no. Now, in Amy, there's a heavy emphasis on the use of intimate footage because we follow her as Capadia's character, quote unquote. She's a real person, but when we're watching a film, we're watching her almost as a character. We see a lot of things we expect of her, the traditional outfits that were associated with her, the songs that we know and love, and also elements of her life that we were aware of and some that we weren't. Was this level of intimacy possible before the digital age? Somewhat. There were, people were still making documentaries before the digital age, but making documentaries has never really been easier, especially if you're focusing on an individual, because there's so much footage of almost everybody. We all leave a digital footprint, and therefore people could use that and manipulate it in ways that we don't necessarily want, or in some cases, to make us look better. So what issues come from manipulating that digital content, and how does Capadia do this in the film? So there's several strands that you could go with this, but he obviously is trying to create an emotional response, and there is an agenda to this. He's highlighting aspects of Amy's life because she didn't necessarily have that justice while she was alive. She was hounded by the paparazzi. She was brought into drug addiction potentially by Blakefield, a civil, and also the neglect from her own father maybe sent her down that spiraling way. He could have stepped in and stopped it, but the film shows us that he didn't. Now, are we getting the correct side of things, or are we getting the most nuanced side of things? Probably not in terms of nuance. Is it correct? Arguably so. But Capadia is able to manipulate us for right or wrong because he's able to splice that digital footage together to create something new and different. Now, I would encourage to look on the Educast website because there is a comprehensive list of documentary techniques that you could talk about. But I'll be talking about some of those techniques as I go through anyway, because they have asked specific questions in the past on what one or two techniques have your documentary filmmakers used to manipulate the audience, or to, something similar to that. So it's important to know those techniques and how they're utilized. Okay. And one of those techniques is, the use of digital footage and how it's manipulated by Capadia. And also, finally, at the end there, due to editing, are we getting a well-rounded story or a glorified best bits reel of someone's life? Now, this is quite an important one, I think, because the way the film is put together, it's very linear, because obviously we get to see Amy as she's young and talented all the way till the end when she's literally being taken out of her house in a body bag. So we see all of these moments of her life. And because the film is relatively quick in terms of seeing someone's entire life, we get to experience that chaotic and frantic aspect of Amy's life. We get to be thrown into that action. But are we just seeing the bits that we are that Capadia wants us to see? Are we not seeing all of those behind the scenes moments? So it's important to understand that although we may agree with the film and we may agree with what Capadia is doing, we may align ourselves with Amy, you have to consider that this has been manipulated to make you feel that way. Okay. And again, I'm a massive supporter of Amy. I've always loved her music, and I think that she was such a tragic person. But you have to separate that like of her from the film itself, and whether or not she's presented in a way that isn't manipulated, or if she's presented in a way that is raw and is important. And one of the ways that we get that, and we get to see those aspects of her, are the audio interviews that Capadia uses, which again is another technique that you can draw upon. Okay, so the other aspect to this is comparison to other documentary styles and documentary filmmakers. Now, my class covered two, which is Michael Moore and Kim Longanotto. So I'll go through those two and sort of talk about their comparisons to Capadia's style. So Michael Moore is described as a polemical director, which means he's a controversial filmmaker. He tends to ask controversial questions, and he does it in quite an abrupt way, or he's very confrontational in the way that he approaches things. In a way, he lets people hang themselves by their own noose, a little bit like Louis Theroux, for one. Whereas Louis Theroux is not necessarily as confrontational as Michael Moore, but Michael Moore creates films to be polemical. And he is what we would call performative, which means that he is in his own documentary, and he is the star of his own documentary, and interviews people physically with himself on camera, and goes into situations to create elements of comedy or suggest irony in certain situations. Okay, so some of his documentaries are things like Fahrenheit 9/11, and also things like Bowling for Columbine, which covered very controversial things such as gun control and the war in Iraq. Now, in terms of him, he is very different to Capadia, whereas Capadia uses things like found footage, audio recorded interviews, and he has a lack of himself in his documentaries. Michael Moore is the star of his documentary. Capadia is not. He puts the focus on one individual usually. So, for example, in his other film, Senna, or the film that you'd watched, which is Amy, using that found footage, we have characters created for us and also situations created for us, rather than having Michael Moore, who creates elements of comedy, irony, and broaches those controversial topics. Of course, Capadia is broaching a controversial topic, but he's clearly taking an aligned stance on it, which makes him quite similar to Michael Moore in that regard, because both of them have an agenda. They have an agenda. Capadia's is to make Amy show her to be the talented artist that she was, while also painting her in a very positive light with some elements of negativity. Whereas Michael Moore, his specific aim is to highlight the irony of certain situations and to criticize and satirize political figures and important figures. Kim Longanotto, on the other hand, is observational. So that means she watches and films, but she doesn't necessarily interfere. And there's a story of her filming one of her documentaries where the person she's focused on, her son, dies during the filming of the documentary, and Kim Longanotto continues to film and continues to characterize this woman, as she calls it. Her particular interest is of feminine stories, especially of those of oppressed women. So you've got like Divorce Iranian style, where she goes to film divorce proceedings in a court, and she follows a woman who wants to divorce her husband because she feels he's abusive and aggressive. And she calls them her characters. She creates a character out of these people, which is quite controversial in a way, because, should you be filming these situations of the intimate moments? The same could be said for Capadia's work, though. Okay. So with that being said, it is important for us to understand how different, but also how similar Kim Longanotto is. So one thing that's similar is that Capadia has a focus on individuals in a more intimate setting, and Longanotto does the same. They focus on one person at a time, usually. So as I said before, Capadia with his film Senna and also Amy, and Longanotto with her films like Divorce Iranian style. They tend to be very intimate. But different to Capadia, because Capadia has a more involved observational style. He's editing and changing or like putting digital footage in a certain order to have an agenda. Whereas Longanotto sort of just lets the camera roll. which means that she gets a more raw style from the person, but there's no fancy editing or changes that she makes to it. Of course, any filmmaker edits, the same as Kim Longanotto definitely edits. But arguably, Capadia's style is more intrusive than that because he is observing this person and creating this exposition of this person, but he's also potentially manipulating reality. So that's the Amy core areas. Moving on then, we've got Keaton's core areas, which is critical debates. And the two debates are expressionism and realist. So I'm just going to briefly go over these because, again, when I go through all of the micro elements of these films, you'll see how I bring out the expressionism and realist from those aspects, okay? So just basically what I want you to keep in your mind is Georges Méliès, which is pioneered the expressionist movement, or was one of the pioneers of the expressionist movement. And it was about the subjective experience of people, meaning their work was much more fantastical, personal, and surreal. Okay, so what you've got to look at is, for example, films like Trip to the Moon, which I'm not going to play because I don't know if I'll end up having the video taken down or copyright struck or whatever it is, and I want you to be able to have this before revision. So Trip to the Moon is incredibly fantastical and expressionist, and it feels over the top and unrealistic in aspects. So it's more about the subjective viewing of the world, like you're viewing something in a certain way. And it links to the German expressionist movement in the 1920s, which you'll see several filmmakers that you will have studied over the course of your A-levels have drawn upon the German expressionist movement, which focused on visuals more than it did, say, dialogue later on. Obviously, there was a very distinct lack of dialogue in silent films and more uses of title cards, but it's more complex and symbolic art. It's meant to represent emotions. So what you're expected to do is link expressionism to Buster Keaton's work. And to be honest, the easiest way to do that is through his more surrealist elements and the surreal gags that he sort of sets up. On the other hand, you've got the Lumiere brothers with the realist style, which intended to capture life with very little interference. And I dread to say it, but I say it almost documentary-like, because they are just recording people going about their daily lives, going about their jobs and so on. And that means that it was holding on to typical conventions of the time without stylizing or modifying it like you might do in an expressionist piece. Instead, you're just focused on the raw aspect of what life is like. And you're expected to link the ideas of realism to Keaton's work as well. And what I would say is the best way to do that is by commenting on his more satirical elements, his use of costume, and also his setting, okay? Because they will all link quite well to those two critical debates. And then my favorite, which is experimental cinema and auteur, which is, and I've written up there, Keaton core area. Really, I need to quickly change that because obviously this is mainly focused on David Lynch. Now, Lynch's work is very distinct, and the two areas that you really need to look at is experimental cinema and auteur. Now, auteur you're quite familiar with, but linking it to experimentation can be a little bit tricky. And also, if you've just learned Mulholland Drive takes a bit of digesting and is not an easy film. So I'm going to start with just the experimentation elements, and the main area they want you to focus on is narrative. Now, Mulholland Drive has a confusing narrative that's made up of multiple strands that are often never resolved, or vignettes that appear to have nothing to do with the narrative until they are explored. And what I mean by being explored is that you go away and you think about them yourselves. This is opposed to traditional Hollywood style because it's not giving you the answers, and it's not giving you very much. It's leaving a lot to you to figure it out as you go. So overall, you would think that some of the aspects, such as the Winky sequence with Dan describing the dread that he fears about going out back of this area and discovering something, his own internal dread, and how that looks like a simple vignette that just has nothing to do with the story. But when you read deeper into it, it's almost like Dan is a representation of Diane and how she is struggling to deal with her own existential dread. So it's really important to understand that this is not typical. That the narrative is very experimental, and they use this through this idea of dream sequences and so on. And my second point there, it says, arguably the vignettes are powerful self-contained narratives that function well on their own without the grander focus of the film. And that was sort of talked about by Roger Ebert, where he said that the vignettes work on their own, and that's why the overall film works, because even if you took those vignettes in isolation, they still make sense. And you may disagree with me. You may have watched this and gone, why the hell did you include that? But that's Lynch's style. He is being surreal, and he has this idea and sort of his his own personal narrative of mystery for mystery's sake. He wants you to think about it and wants you to think back as to what things represent and what they mean to you as an individual as you watch. Also, the lack of true linearity to the story and the fact dreams are utilized add a really surreal aspect to the narrative that needs to be watched repeatedly to understand. And that links on to that point of the audience is never necessarily satisfied, and you have to come to your own conclusions, which is exactly Lynch's point. So what I want you to think about when I go over this is think about Betty's story, think about Rita's story, and how that transfers to Diane's and Camilla's story, or even the story of Adam, and how those surrealist elements that appear in the dreamlike sequences also link to the surrealist elements that are in the out of dream sequences. Do they have their own distinct meanings? Do some of the motifs that are apparent in Lynch's work have deeper meanings later on, or have multiple meanings that you could draw upon? That is the beauty of the experimentative nature of Lynch's work. Okay, and that brings me on to auteur theory when it comes to Lynch. He's probably one of the most prolific American auteurs, and probably my personal favorite director. I think he's fantastic. And a lot of his films have brought surrealist filmmaking back to mainstream American cinema. Without his work in pioneering that surrealist style and more experimental narrative, we wouldn't have those films like Mulholland Drive, Inland Empire, and even shows like Twin Peaks that challenge us on a more existential level. The same way as things like Lovecraft Country, shows like that, which draw upon those surrealist aspects and work that is a little bit more cosmic. Lynch's films often find disturbing and unsettling aspects to mundane life and enhance them and make them quite troubling to watch. So Lynch represents the dark underbelly of everyday life. So if you look at Mulholland Drive, it's the dark underbelly of Los Angeles and Hollywood itself. Things like the casting couch and the abuse of women and so on, and how they've got to essentially sleep their way to the top in order to become successful in such a masculine dominated and cruel environment. Or you've got Blue Velvet, which covers the dark underbelly of American suburbia. And these are powerful motifs that linger through Lynch's work and force the audience to come to their own conclusions, because he purposely abandons plot threads and jumps to different sequences with unknown characters that are meant to prove a point. And that brings me on to the idea of Lynch's work often being the antithesis of mainstream. He doesn't pander to the audience, which is not something that you're familiar with in modern films. Whereas films that are often produced by companies such as Disney and so on, they are there to pander to an audience. Lynch doesn't do that. His aim is not to pander to you. His aim is to give you questions and make you think. Okay? And this comes out quite strongly in his interviews. If you've ever watched any of David Lynch's interviews, he gives absolutely nothing away, and that is purposeful. He is not allowing you to have his perspective, and when he does give it away, it's always incredibly cryptic, and it doesn't sort of tell you the whole story. For example, his 10 clues to figuring out the plot to Mulholland Drive, or his 3-act structure that he talks about. That's meant to be on you to figure out. And that's why in his 3-act structure, the very last act, Act 3, is just called Love. What does that mean? No one knows. And it's about trying to understand and come to grips with what he means by that. One of the good contextual elements to talk about is his practice of transcendental meditation, which can be argued to feature in the more dreamlike quality of his films and shows. So like Inland, and the reason I'm saying like films like Inland Empire and his show Twin Peaks is because you will have studied Mulholland Drive, but you may not have studied or even watched things like Inland Empire, Eraserhead, Blue Velvet. But they're important for you to understand that that element of dreamlike quality in the dark underbelly of society comes through screaming in films like that. But it gives a challenging aspect to his films. And one final point I'm going to make about his auteurism is his intertextuality. So if you're not sure what postmodern cinema is, it's this idea of moving away from modernism. Whereas modernism was all about changing and adapting and coming up with new ideas, postmodernism was more about drawing upon those past ideas and those past concepts, for example, like surrealism, and then bringing it and then changing it and adding a little spin on it and bringing it into the modern world. So his intertextuality of referencing films like Sunset Boulevard gives a new dimension to Mulholland Drive as it commentates on 1950s Americana, and even like golden age of Hollywood style. Okay, so those are just a few things to think about while I get into the micro elements. And when I go through all of the different micro elements, I'm going to go through them relatively quickly, but you can pause the video anytime and read what I put on each slide. So first of all, just to talk about cinematography, and I've tried to make it 2 to 3 points per film. So for Amy, footage is found footage and is often more intimate angles such as close-ups and POV. Although powerful, it could arguably be manipulative or in poor taste. So that links to the specialist area that I was talking about earlier. Drone footage is the only footage that's actually filmed by Keaton himself, and it's there to establish important location information. And that is often to just contextualize it for the audience so we know where we are and the importance of that place within Amy's life. And also the use of zooming in on the found footage, which comes sometimes from Keaton himself, who zooms in on the footage, or within the footage itself, adds elements of characterization to Amy, much like in a standard film. So we see her as a character. In Buster Keaton's work, camera is often very static and avoids too much movement. Much of Keaton's gags utilize the static camera to bring surprises onto the screen to set up a punchline. So his work utilized a lot of long shots for the audience to explore the gag themselves, so we can watch everything coming together on the screen without it moving around too much. And when we get to editing later, the editing was very simplistic because of the time period, but also tried experimenting with new forms of it. But also this framing style puts Buster Keaton in the center frame and allows the audience to absorb his deadpan expression as the scene was sort of evolving around him, and adds to that comedy. So framing and static camera are really important for the cinematography in Buster Keaton's work. And in Mulholland Drive, Lynch uses the camera in rather unsettling ways, with lingering close-ups and uncomfortable long takes to add to the malice in everyday situations, as I talked about earlier when talking about how his auteurism is constructed. Lighting effectively enhanced the dreamlike quality of Betty and Rita's sequences by lighting both women in nightlight style. And that's taken directly from the WJC's specific specialist information. It's a really important bit because having night lighting shows them to be glowing a little bit more as if they're in a dream. And you see that quite heavily, especially with Betty. Lynch's focus on the mundane or seemingly unimportant details with the camera allows the audience to create their own interpretations. The camera is pointing at something, but it isn't revealing anything about it. And it's all about that idea of mystery for mystery's sake. Okay. Next up is mise en scène. So Capaldi's decision to choose footage that suggests juxtaposition through setting, props, and costume allow the audience to see the evolution of Amy from a talented singer to an addicted tragedy. So what you've got to imagine is her changing outfits to the more iconic looks that we remember from her, especially the iconic looks that were captured of her by the paparazzi. The props, meaning like the drug paraphernalia that's sort of around the place, even things like her microphones and being near a microphone because of how prolific she was as a singer. You've also got Amy being characterized through her iconic costume and looks, but also allows the audience a level of voyeurism that may make us uncomfortable, that we're seeing the more intimate aspects of her setting and her life. So this comes out with the drug paraphernalia sequences. In Buster Keaton, there's a range of costumes that reflect the realist approach to cinema. All of their costumes are traditional for the time, and they rarely make use of fantastical costumes. You could say some costumes are sometimes a little over the top, for example, in The High Sign, but instead they tend to make their humor out of outlandish situations rather than out of an outlandish costume. And the props used by Keaton are often important to the gags in the films. For example, the ladder in Cops, or the use of geometrical shapes with the kitchen scene, where they've got all of like the salt and pepper and the sauces and so on little strings, and they're thrown around the place. And it sets up quite aesthetically pleasing, but also very complex gags. And in 1 week, the house is representative of the Cubist movement, which shows a realist, because obviously the Cubist movement was happening around this time, or was sort of like within this time period. So that means it's contextually sound, but also expressionist because of the house itself. The use of that house itself almost adds this surreal Cubist aspect, whereas it adds to realist because it's almost commentating on an art movement that was going on at the time, potentially making fun of it a little bit. And in Mulholland Drive, Lynch is obsessed with the use of symbols. So the blue key, Club Silencio, Rita or Camilla's outfits, the blonde wigs, and so on. They're all powerful symbols that you can sort of read into. And relatively unimportant seeming objects can hold real significance. So, for example, the use of the phone and how it rings around at the beginning of the film, how it's placed next to certain people or objects until eventually it's placed next to a red lamp, which brings out the idea of like the red light district, women having to prostitute themselves out to get ahead in Hollywood, and drums up so many different meanings. And the typical costume in the film is reminiscent of the 1950s, which Lynch uses to replicate the golden age of Americana, but it often has a sinister undertone. Okay. Now, for context, Amy wasn't well received by Mitch Winehouse and Blake Fielder Civil, because in the film, it was argued that they were villainized. Mitch for being this neglectful father who was money grabbing and wanted to use Amy for his own ends, and Blake Fielder Civil for being the one that introduced Amy to hard drugs. Or at least harder drugs. And so neither one of them received the film very well. And Mitch Winehouse tried everything in his power to show it himself as being misrepresented by the film. Capadia also produces documentaries like Amy and Senna that focus on the individual and telling their story using audio recorded interviews and visual found footage. So this approach does give an intimate look, but is often criticized as invasive and very easy to manipulate, because obviously we have access to a wide range of footage from Amy, and not all of it is very positive. And the film is heavily critical of paparazzi and the power the media have to contribute to the destruction of an individual. Like, if the media turn against you, that is pretty much your end. The film doesn't explicitly tell us this. At no point does Capadia come onto screen and go, paparazzi bad. But it's very implicit through the chosen footage and audio recordings that that is the aim of the film, to show the paparazzi as being quite a negative influence. For Buster Keaton, he had his start in vaudeville theatre and transferred the skills learned from icons such as Houdini to the real screen, because Houdini was his godfather. His focus on physical comedy links to those roots, because his style became perfect for silent cinema because it was the visual nature of it. And to my class, I used the comparison to Mr. Bean, of the idea that Mr. Bean is universal because it's very physical and you can understand what's going on without knowing any dialogue or needing any dialogue. And that's the same for Buster Keaton. He had universal appeal because you didn't really have to understand much of what was going on. You could just enjoy the gags. And Keaton's work incorporates elements of surrealism through his more dreamlike sequences, because the art movement was particularly important in demonstrating expressionist attitudes through Keaton's work, about how everything seems like a dream because of his expression being so blank, the typical Keaton deadpan expression. And also the use of satirical commentaries, so like the Build a House in 1 Week and the Gang in High Sign, suggest that Keaton was keen to represent the time in which he lived in a semi-realist sense. So, for example, in the High Sign, the gang is sort of representative of World War I gangs that formed after the war, when soldiers really had nothing to do, or they were suffering from things like PTSD, or they were struggling to get out of the warlike mentality, and formed gangs of like-minded people. And although it's done in quite a comical way in the High Sign, it's still realist and it's still representative of what these gangs were like at the time. For Mulholland Drive, it was initially meant to be a TV series, but fell through during production. And Lynch was particularly upset by this, and Adam's storyline in the film could link to his frustration with the TV executives and the sort of ringer they pulled him through before he was able to eventually create Mulholland Drive as a film. And Lynch's use of dreams as a motif throughout much of his work links to his surrealist approach, and his postmodern take on surrealism filters through much of his work as he challenges typical film conventions through experimental style, so using Sunset Boulevard, for example. And Lynch essentially commented upon Hollywood's dark underbelly before the events of #MeToo. So he was sort of exposing those aspects of Hollywood before it was more widely known. And he was sort of happy to hold up the mirror to Hollywood and suggest that what it was doing to young women especially wasn't necessarily the right way, or even in any way legal or empowering or positive. And he uses that throughout the film to show the terrible aspects of being a woman in Hollywood. In terms of editing, Amy is edited to splice different elements of footage from her life together, meaning the chosen product can be heavily manipulated to suit a message or a value that's being pushed. And superimposing text to tell location gives a sense of linearity to Amy's story and allows us to experience or follow those iconic locations from her life. So the Back to Black recording with Mark Ronson is quite important for that aspect. And also the editing style of being quite fast, so the pace being of speed, suggests the quick and chaotic life that she led. So moving on from, recording her first contracts, getting into drugs, falling apart at Belgrade, her death, all happens over the course of a 2-hour documentary. It's quite impressive to fit that much of a life into it. And that means the pace needs to be quite fast. Now, for Buster Keaton, editing is primarily quite simple cuts that are specifically there for continuity editing, moving on to the next sequence and continuing the story, or what loose elements of the story are present. However, 1 week has an element of surrealist editing that I would draw upon if you're asked about editing, which is the use of editing in the bath sequence, because the cameraman covers the camera with his hand to uphold the decency of the subject he's filming. And this breaking of the fourth wall is quite an iconic moment from the film and demonstrates experimentation of early editing, because obviously cutting from one sequence to the other would have been fine, but having the cameraman cover the camera adds that experimental style of early cinema to sort of turn that sequence into a gag rather than just some traditional cut. Also, using setting to help with editing was quite important in early cinema. So the bars, for example, at the beginning of Cops, where it looks like Buster Keaton's behind bars, but in reality, he's not. He's just outside the gates of his love interest. And there isn't any need for advanced editing in that section because they just use setting to help with editing. And also the heavy use of long takes to set up gags is so important to understand because there's not a lot of cutting, so you can absorb the gag as it goes on and is executed expertly by Buster Keaton because he was very focused on having the perfect gag and the perfect payoff. For Mulholland Drive, there are several unsettling long takes that enhance the eerie atmosphere that Lynch is trying to create. So, for example, in the Winky sequence, there's a shot reverse shot that is used with a shaky camera to show Dan's conversation. Whenever we cut to him, the takes are often unsettlingly long and they tend to zoom in on him, which I know is an element of cinematography, but still it's important in terms of editing. But also cutting to screaming faces and reactions from characters contributes to this unsettling feeling that Lynch is hoping to achieve. So, for example, Dan after meeting the bum in the alleyway, or the discovery of the corpse in the apartment by Betty and Rita and their reactions to discovering that. In terms of sound, Amy, Capadia chose to use audio recordings rather than physical interviews as he believed people act up for the camera and he wanted more raw emotion. So the audio recordings used in the film are personal and reflect a level of intimacy with Amy for the observer. So these audio recordings punctuate important elements of Amy's story and often involve these heavy emotions. So, for example, her best friend's crying after sort of talking about her death and the spiral that she was going down, or Blake Fielder Civil sort of punctuating footage of her taking drugs with him saying, I first helped Amy try crack when. And also isolating vocals such in the Back to Black sequence. So when they cut out music and just isolate her raw vocals, emphasize the talent that was lost by Amy's death and sort of adds a really melancholic overtone to the film. Now, Buster Keaton, you might be thinking, oh my God, silent film, but it's very unlikely they will ask you about sound. But on the off chance that something came up, photo players would have played along with the films in the cinemas to reflect what was going on the screen. And these plays were often essential to reflect some of the more bizarre moments and give a sense of excitement that reflected the visuals. And any dialogue is sort of done through title cards. But Keaton himself was against using them for too many sequences and instead focused on the visual aspect, much like German expressionists at the time. He wanted to mainly focus on visuals, which several directors took forward from this point onwards. So dialogue was sort of secondary, hence why he limited the use of title cards. He just wanted people to see the visuals and know the plot from that. For Mulholland Drive, there's deep, unsettling sounds, and they're used in mundane situations to enhance Lynch's many auteuristic features. It's like a throbbing bass is what they call it in the Educast handbook, which sort of punctuates these more like unsettling moments and makes you feel on edge along with the footage that you're seeing. But the footage could just be simply somebody drinking an espresso, or just a lingering shot, or a POV as we walk towards the alleyway. All of these things are mundane, but the music and unsettling throbbing bass is used to describe or help us understand it. So the music use as well, and the death of Diane in the ending sequence adds to the melancholic nature of the film and could be linked to the tenets of tragedy. And this is where my English teacher comes out a little bit. So the idea of a catharsis or a release of emotion at the end of a traumatic or tragic play is often used in tragic theatre. So having her die towards the end of the film and then having this sort of melancholic sound with overlaps of superimposition of Betty's face and happier moments adds to the trauma and the catharsis of releasing that emotion at the end of the film. Also, dialogue delivered by Betty, and apparently the name is Diance, but Diane, and Rita and Camilla is massively different in terms of their tone. So this comes under performance a little bit, but dialogue is quite interesting for both of them because their dialogue changes quite abruptly depending on who they're playing. And in terms of performance, which is the final area I'll cover here, Amy herself is depicted as the heroine of the story through the intimate time that we spend with her. Because the linear story allows us to see her life, it becomes all the more tragic when our character begins to struggle and lose herself in key moments because we see her performed for us. And the footage that's been chosen presents her in a certain light as this tragic character that we need to sympathize with. And the audio recorded interviewees become characters in their own rights, with Blake and Mitch being depicted as villains either through their own performance or Capadia's clever use of editing. So Buster Keaton, Keaton's deadpan delivery is integral for creating him as an auteur, and I put auteur in quote unquote because obviously the term auteur wasn't really coined at this point, but he became the sole focus of the film. So his expression became synonymous with his work and didn't necessarily translate very well after the silent film era. But the deadpan delivery, he created a more surrealist angle to his films that links well with the expressionist values, which uses a bit of realism to enhance the ridiculousness of the situation. And also Keaton's physicality in his performance plays a huge role in the surrealism of several gags. And I say there, it almost looks like he's made out of rubber because he sort of just bounces off the floor and does ridiculous things and almost looks like he's injuring himself in the process. And then finally for Mulholland Drive, both Betty and Diane and Rita and Camilla, the performance was very challenging as they were playing two different characters who shared the same appearance but act completely differently. So they're almost internal binary opposites and lend itself well to the surrealist angle that Lynch was going for, that these two people are played by the same actress but are two different characters. And they also both highlight the different archetypes that Hollywood women often fit into. So like the over-sexualized lesbian, or the typical doe-eyed new actress, or the bitter and damaged actress who's been worn down by decades of abuse. It's almost a commentary on the shallow roles that women have in the industry. And if you wanted to comment on the actress themselves, Naomi Watts was heavily praised for her ability to switch between the peppy Diane and the bitter and destroyed, the peppy Betty and the bitter and destroyed Diane. So, as I said, this is not a comprehensive list. Do not comment on the video or do not send me a message and say, you haven't covered this, you haven't covered that. This will never be a comprehensive video. I do not have the time to go through every single aspect of these films for your revision. But these elements that I've covered hopefully link enough to the specialist areas that you can comment on them if needed. Okay, so I hope that's been useful, and I will see you in the next video.